Schoenberg himself talked about his team in a BBC Sound broadcast.
Well, I would say that Mr. G.E. Cunliffe was my right-hand man on many problems, on many ways, in many ways.
G.E. Cunliffe, former director of research at EMI, now retired and farming in Oxfordshire.
The management decided to go ahead and expand the laboratory, and I was given the job of going to Cambridge and to other universities to recruit staff. At Cambridge, I met Sir John Chadwick, who I'd known years ago, and he introduced quite a number of quite brilliant young men who stayed with us and worked throughout the whole of the television development.
One of those brilliant young men was J.D. McGee, now a Fellow of the Royal Society and Professor of Applied Physics at Imperial College, London. McGee was recruited from a brilliant research group at the Cavendish Laboratory. Nearly every man in the front row of this photograph, taken in 1929, later became a Nobel Prize winner. But it was the Depression, and work was short, even for physicists.
When Mr. Cunliffe from EMI came to Cambridge and offered me this job through Sir James Chadwick, Chadwick came to me and said, "Well, McGee, I think you'd better take it, because after all, I don't think this television business is likely ever to come to very much, but after all, it is a job, and it'll keep you going until we can get you a proper job."
With McGee from Cambridge came E.L.C. White, now chief scientist of EMI Electronics. He was to do brilliant work on circuitry. From Cambridge, too, came J.E. Cairns, now director of the company's valve division, who was to take charge of production of the cathode ray tube, and L.F. Broadway, who also worked on cathode ray tubes and is now director of the research laboratories. Already from the gramophone company had come C.O. Brown, who was to design the Alexandra Palace installation. He, like many others of this outstanding team, moved straight on to vital radar research when war began. They were in a Halifax bomber doing radar experiments on the afternoon of June the 7th, 1942, when the plane caught fire and crashed. Killed with Brown were two others from EMI, one of them a very remarkable man indeed, Alan Blumlein.
From Secretary of State for Air, Personal and Secret. Dear Mr. Schoenberg, it was with deep regret that I learned last Sunday...
Professor McGee was a close friend of Blumlein.
It's my considered opinion that he was the greatest engineer-scientist that I have ever known. I think that had he lived, he would have been considered the Michael Faraday of our present age. As Schoenberg said of him after his tragic death, there wasn't a single subject to which he turned his mind which he did not enrich.
About 10 years ago, I was visiting a commercial TV station in the Midlands. The chief engineer, and talking to the chief engineer, he told me that one of his junior engineers had come up to him one day and said, "Who is this fellow Blumlein? His name's appearing on all the patents. Anything new or novel, you usually find that Blumlein has been there before."
In fact, in 17 working years, Blumlein filed 132 patents, one every 46 days. Blumlein, McGee, White, Cairns, Cunliffe, Brown, these were the leaders of Schoenberg's team.
I was saying to my boys that we are lighting a candle that will not be put out.
Their candle was virtually this. The heart of an electronic system lies in the camera here. It starts with a lens, and when Schoenberg's team began work, that was more or less where it finished. But a camera also consists of a pickup tube. It still causes most problems. That had to be made, and it had to work, and this was McGee's job.
It's difficult to realize what a formidable problem the making of a television camera tube was in the early 1930s. one must realize that even today, the making of a television camera tube is one of the most difficult and sophisticated problems in the whole of the electronic tube industry.
In the early 30s, such problems as the making of the photosensitive surface and the production and focusing of the electronic beam were little understood. Even glass technology for making the tubes was fairly primitive.
At that time, we had to combine all these difficult technologies into one tube and get it to work. And this was really a very difficult problem at that stage in the development of technology. One should say, I think, that perhaps 5 years previously, it would have been almost impossible.
From the pickup tube, the signal passes through a cable. It, too, had to be created from nothing. Baird signals were transmitted along BBC sound lines, but a good electronic picture requires a frequency range of between 0 and 3 million cycles per second, a then unheard-of bandwidth. That, too, had to be worked out. The signal had to be modulated. It had to be fed through control units, and then Marconi's, working with EMI, had to devise aerials and very short-wave transmitters. And of course, finally, there was the problem of developing cathode ray tubes for receivers. All Schoenberg and his men had to go on were patents filed by Zworykin and by other scientists in France, Hungary, and Germany. But patents were just plans. All the work of creating a television system was still to be achieved. At one point, RCA offered to take the burden of developing television off the English company altogether. But Schoenberg said, no, we'll do it ourselves. And in less than 4 years, they did.
The staff worked itself out to almost a standstill. In fact, one night, Blumlein, almost from sheer exhaustion, collapsed and fell into the equipment.
I can still feel the tremendous thrill of excitement at seeing the first actual television picture produced by a camera tube. Our feeling at that time, I think, must have been very similar to the feeling of Thomas Edison when he first invented the electric light. The story goes that he and his associates sat round this first electric light, just looking at it in astonishment for several hours until it finally burnt out. We were, in the same way, inclined to sit round and just look at the picture from a television camera, hardly believing that it could be possible.
As late as 1932 and early 1933, most of the team was still working on mechanical systems, while McGee and his colleagues wrestled with enormous problems of electronic methods. The others tried a 120-line system, then a 180-line system, but they were still mechanical. McGee and his team worked grimly on, trying to make an electronic camera that worked. McGee recalls a conversation just before he left the Cavendish.
Walton remarked to me, as we were saying goodbye, that he thought that if television were ever to be done successfully, it would have to be done by the use of electron beam tubes, cathode ray tubes, as had been proposed by Campbell Swinton. When I went to EMI and read in more detail Campbell Swinton's proposals, this view was confirmed in my mind.
But for EMI, time was beginning to run out. The Baird Company were on the air. They were transmitting pictures. Among the program fare offered in 1933 was a boxing contest, a sea lion that played the saxophone, and the first television review. Altogether, Baird Television put out 76 transmissions in 1932. In 1933, the total rose to 208. And it was in the summer of 1933 that the BBC undertook its first piece of television audience research.